Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're in the final stretch of the course. Thank you for your papers last week. We have the presentations due on the 29th. I've spoken with a number of you. I know you've been talking with your TFs as well. We hope you're excited about this. We wanted to draw your attention to some resources that exist around the university, in particular the multimedia lab at Lamont Library. They know about this class. They know about this project. They're very enthusiastic to offer any help, assistance they can. You'll find not only they have an enormous suite of software there, some very high-priced stuff that you can do all sorts of technically advanced things with, but they also have some recording facilities. They have mobile cameras. They have a lot of different stuff that you're very welcome to use. So feel free to give them a visit. We thought about organizing them speaking in class, but they thought the more efficient way to work this would be for you to have an open invitation to visit the lab at any point. But consider that one major resource as you go forward. I should note we've made this observation in talking with different TFs, and to swing back to the beginning of the course, institutional corruption is more than something you just don't agree with. It's more than something you think is bad. It's something that is embedded within some institutional structure that you think is a deviation from its normative or legitimating purpose. And keeping that in mind, we will help you as you structure the arguments of your presentations. That being said, in the final stretch here, this week, our topic and our consideration is the corruption of knowledge. So we've thought a lot about institutions out there in the world that produce sorts of things, that provide services, and this week we're getting a little closer to home because we're thinking in the wake of Congress and our discussion last week of the legislative branch of the United States government, today we're thinking about what's sometimes been called a fourth branch of government, that is the press. The ability to investigate, to report, to have exposés, to somehow communicate what's most important to know to the citizens so they can act upon it. You'll note that in other countries, authoritarian countries, one thing that is very important for the executive branches those countries do is control the media. We're familiar with examples of censorship, of controlling information flow. And this is something that's a constant issue of debate in our sort of current democracy as well, as how information can be controlled, how should it be controlled. By and large, I think the United States is pretty good in terms of freedoms of the press, at least formal protections. But it's one thing to not have censorship. It's another thing to think about what are the interests behind the kind of information, news, investigation, understandings that we have. And that's the key to our discussions this week. Today we have we have one practicing investigative journalist with us, Brooke Williams, who I'll introduce in the second half. We also have somebody who's bridged legal, academic, philosophical, and practical divides, Marie Newhouse, who's going to lead us off. Marie's someone who worked for many years in the think tank world in Washington, D.C. She's trained as a lawyer. She came back here, did a PhD at the Kennedy School, and is a law professor, heading to be a law professor in the UK, spent the last 2 years at the Saffer Center for Ethics, working on think tank ethics. And the bridge between today and Thursday's lecture is that in Thursday we're thinking very much about universities as the sort of quintessential source of the most advanced knowledge we have in our societies today and how those might be corrupted. But today is a question about the knowledge that we all consume, the knowledge out there in the world that we get from our think tanks and from our journalism. Before I turn the podium over to Marie, I just want to mention, if you're interested in this, we had the Andrew Sullivan lecture a week and a half ago or so. Shira Center, who is political editor of Roll Call, she's going to be doing a dinner tonight at Kirkland. If anybody's interested in talking with her about some of the journalism themes we discussed today, come see me at the end of the class. We still have a few seats left for that. So let me turn it over to Marie, who's going to get us started with a discussion of think tanks, what they do, and what are the ethics of integrity that ought to define the kind of knowledge they produce.
Thank you. Okay. So I've been working on this project for a while, and I have a very personal interest in it because I do come out of a couple of think tanks myself. I used to work at the Cato Institute, and then I worked at the Manhattan Institute after that, before going back to graduate school and during graduate school. So I'm going to be talking about think tank ethics and some of these sort of moral hazards that face public policy researchers who are trying to have real-world impact. Most of the sort of evidence that I'm going to present today are interesting excerpts from an anonymous semi-structured interview series that I've been doing of working think tank wonks who basically live and work in the think tank universe in Washington, D.C. and publish substantial research projects. So first, what is a think tank? Well, people disagree about where the fuzzy edges of this concept is, but a think tank can generally be considered an organization, usually a nonprofit, that performs public policy research and advocacy. Now, because it does research, it might remind us in some ways of a university, but of course, it's very different from a university in a couple of important ways. One is it doesn't educate students, but the other is that it's organized around the notion of achieving some kind of goal, understood as a real change in the world for what, by the think tank's own lights, would be a better change. And so think tanks describe these goals differently. For example, it might be improving the lives of Americans through progressive ideas and action. It might be to formulate and promote conservative policies based on the principles of free enterprise. Objective analysis of and concrete solutions to a wide range of international economic problems, or even more generally, it might just be quality, independence, and impact. But because they all have goals of actual social change in the world, they have some distinctive research challenges. And those distinctive research challenges are the subject of my presentation today. So here's a policy wonk. And as we said, a policy wonk is trying to help bring about a goal, a certain kind of salutary change in the world we live in. But she's trying to do so in a very specific way. She's trying to do so through a research process. She's conducting research in furtherance of a goal. And the problem with this is that research is actually a pretty expensive and uncertain way to bring about social change. You know, research is indispensable in the long run to social change because you can't have change without having new ideas and insights, without learning new things about the world around us. But in the short run, there are cheaper and easier ways to accomplish that because you run into problems when you do research for social change. And one of them is disappointing results. So you may have a policy that you think will work and you're really excited about it and you undertake this big analysis to show that it works and you find out that it doesn't work. It's a disappointing result. And this is a scary thing for policy wonks. This is one of my anonymous research subjects. PPEC basically stands for the Professional Practices and Ethical Commitments of Think Tank Professionals. So PPEC participant is always going to refer to one of my study participants. And this one says, if a policy doesn't work, it doesn't work. But people will be disappointed with that. They will feel like you're not useful in your role, that you're wasting time. So that's one fear that policy wonks can have. Another fear that they can have is that they're going to get politically non-viable results. So sometimes, say you're trying to figure out what policy approach will really work to achieve, goal X that we all want. But the answer you come up with is something that no political actors are willing to do, or even willing to seriously consider doing, right? So you've failed to advance this goal of bringing about positive change in the world because you've come up with a policy idea that nobody's willing to implement. And this is scary for wonks too. So a participant says, it's like telling a fat kid who just wants Oreos that he has to eat his spinach. To say, look, I realize that you really, really, really want to do X, but there's just no support. There's no scientific or scholarly support for doing X. There's no reason to believe that X is going to have the effect you want it to have. But if you're an eat your spinach think tanker, you're not influential. You don't change the world. So these fears create a sort of moral hazard for think tankers. Because there are other ways to bring about social change goals. There are faster, easier, and more reliable ways, in fact. And two very tempting ways for wonks to resort to instead of research to achieve goals are punditry and politics. Not only are individual think tankers sort of privately incentivized to resort to punditry and politics in order to be seen to be effective, to be advancing their goals, but institutions are under pressure too, to be seen to funders and to the public to be advancing their institutional goals. Plus, the people that run these think tanks believe that the goals are valuable and just goals. So even just within their own hearts, they find that they're incentivized to cut corners sometimes and engage in punditry and politics instead of research, which is sort of supposed to be the distinctive means by which think tanks advance these goals. So here, a participant talks about pressure to be a pundit. And he says, we have this enormous media department, and their incentive is to try to get scholars on TV. They respond to that incentive by trying as hard as they can to get scholars in TV or radio or what have you. My point of view is that I don't like going on TV or the radio to talk about something I don't know very much about. So there's a real disconnect in terms of the incentives that they face, getting people on TV and the radio, and my own orientation toward it of not looking like an idiot. That's what really bothers me. So I try to avoid that, but at some cost, I suppose, because think tankers are rewarded for getting media attention, because they're helping to change the world. Here's the pressure that one participant talked about to be political. And the sense in which I want to talk about politics right now is advancing arguments that maybe you don't believe simply because they're politically effective, or they're the kinds of arguments that lawmakers are going to respond to by actually doing something. So this participant says, if we get too political, we diminish the value that we bring. For example, people keep shouting, energy independence, energy independence. At first, it was a political message. But then, guess what? It got picked up by certain think tanks. I have refused to say energy independence because that would mean that we could do whatever we want. That if something happened in the oil markets, that we'd be protected. That's never true. We are part of a global market. We're going to pay the price for whatever happens somewhere else. So an example of pressure that an individual wonk might feel to go with a message that she doesn't privately believe is true, but which is popular with political actors. And here's actually a very similar thing. I've got a participant who says, I support working in good faith towards a world without nuclear weapons. One of the arguments that's often advanced for doing that is that it would reduce the risk of nuclear terrorism. I think there is no link between those two things. Because I just didn't think it was a good argument, I wasn't willing to make that argument publicly, even though many of the communicators thought that was a useful argument to make publicly. So think tanks, of course, even beyond what I've already told you about the desire to sort of appear to be good at your job, have this other problem. Like all nonprofit organizations, they're dependent on funders, usually a mix of individuals, foundations, and corporations that make it possible for the think tank to continue to do what it does. And so funders generate a lot of pressures on good scholarship, and some of these pressures can best be described as naked self-interest. And I know Brooke will talk about this later, but I have a few examples of naked self-interest that my participants have pointed out to me. Here's one. The Korean government is currently engaged in a negotiation with the US over US-Korea nuclear cooperation. It's an incredibly contentious negotiation. Korea wants to reprocess spent nuclear fuel. The Korean government has offered money to US think tanks to do research. I do not believe that what they were saying was as blatant as, we will give you money if you promote our position. But this was money that my think tank was offered and we didn't accept because we felt that even if there was no formal quid pro quo, it was expected that we would come up with certain results. So a good example of a state trying to advance its interests by sort of buying influence in think tanks that are producing research. Here's another one. A lot of funders don't really come to you with a project idea, but what happens is you go to a funder and say, will you please support my program? And then a funder will say, well, I don't want to support your program per se. I want to make sure that my money is going to what I want it to go to. So are you guys doing anything on shale gas? And I'll say, yeah, we are. And they say, well, can you do something in New York? Because I have headaches in New York. And so this is toddling right up to that line where if you cross it, you start to become a lobbyist, right, instead of a researcher. And the problem with, signing up with donors who have these predetermined conclusions that they want you to work on is that it endangers your ability to learn new things about the world because you know the whole time that you're being paid not to learn something new about the world, but to come to a predetermined conclusion that supports the interests of the funder. So that's a danger. Here's still more naked self-interest. I know someone who was writing a report and felt very strongly about including a certain message, but it would have definitely put the funder in a corner in a way. So it got taken out, and it got taken out by a higher up who valued that funding and the potential for renewed multi-year funding. So it was like, keep this to yourself now, and you can say it later once we get the funding. But usually there is no later, because if you want the funding now, maybe you can get even more funding later. So you can see how, on the margin, you might say, well, I'm not really selling out my integrity on this because, I'll just, sort of serve up the spinach, as my other participant said, later, further on down the line. But later too often never comes because you form these ongoing dependencies with funders. And one final thing about naked self-interest. This was fascinating to me because I didn't know about this. I don't have very much experience with the sort of foreign policy and defense end of think tanking. Apparently, classification can be used to get rid of research. This participant said, I think we run into situations in which particular individuals in the US Defense Department don't want findings to be released. And so instead of not publishing something, sometimes people will classify it so that no one can read it. So I see that as a challenge too. How we classify things has the same effect sometimes as just canceling or stopping a project. So if your project is too unwelcome, and a lot of money that goes to think tanks does come from the US Defense Department, then classification is something that can happen to your project. And if you've spent, this participant was telling me, like some people will spend a year or two writing a book, and it's just a huge career building thing for them. And if that book gets classified, then they're unable to sort of show off their professional accomplishments in their own professional arena. And that's bad for the debate, and it's also bad for them personally. So they have an incentive not to produce something that's going to wind up being classified. And that can have a detrimental impact on research. Now, we talked about naked self-interest, but at least as often, if not more often, funders can put pressure on research simply because they have a sincere desire to achieve the goal of the think tank due to a belief that the goal is a worthy one. So most funders, I would say, certainly a lot of funders, it differs from think tank to think tank, but the most reputable think tanks are primarily funded by foundations and individuals who are primarily most of the time out to support the goal. They want to advance this notion of this particular kind of social change that they believe is valuable. But that can create problems too. And one problem is just that sometimes the funders are wedded to ineffective strategies that wind up, sort of frittering away think tank resources at the expense of research. And here's one participant that says, the public events are interesting for informing the public, but I don't know if they really enhance the debate. We do a lot of public events because funders and groups that we're working with really like the notion that there's a public event. So even the X Foundation, for instance, will want us to have a public event about something they funded. But I don't know that that's the place where you really see the debate pushed the furthest. So questionable deployments of resources. Here's Bruce Bartlett, not a participant, but somebody I just interviewed on the record. And he had a point about this. He said, Hoover has some very, very expensive, glossy, high production publications they put out. I think it's called Hoover Digest, and it's printed out just for the donors, who, he points out, are older. And they're not going to go online and look at this stuff. They need to have it delivered to them through the mail. They look at it and say, oh, this is very, very nice, and then throw it away. A lot of what think tanks do is unfortunately biased toward what their donors like. The problem is donors are very unsophisticated. They don't know the difference between something that works and something that simply looks like it works. So the other thing that funders will, well-intentioned funders who are basically, on board with the goals of the institution and want to fund the achievement of those goals, those funders can put pressure on think tankers to be influential. Because of course, if you're not influential, you can't achieve your goal. But as I explained earlier, the desire to be influential can put pressure on good research practices. So here's Tom Carruthers, who's a research vice president at the Carnegie Endowment, and he's talking about how the pressure to appear influential causes researchers to spend more time than they ought to be spending on media and punditry instead of on research. So he says, one of the pressures in Washington is our name in the paper all the time. You will be at a board of directors meeting, and board of directors are usually composed at least in part of the largest donors to the organization. And there's a sheet that's handed out that says, we're cited in the New York Times X times in 2012. And board members say, that's great. Next year, let's do 2X. Rather than saying, well, that's great, but are we being cited because we're doing really important original research? Or are we just being cited a lot because we had a great media coordinator? Here's more pressure to be influential. One of my participants says, think tanks want to be able to tell their donors that they're influential. And the way to become influential is not by tearing down conventional wisdom. So in that sense, it's very different from a university. It's advantageous to a university scholar to have some big, excellent, rigorous work that says received wisdom about the financial markets is wrong. But that's not what Washington wants. And you're definitely not going to be influential if you're tearing down an entire edifice of conventional wisdom in Washington. So you can see how the desire to influence policymakers puts pressure on researchers to come to conclusions that are already pretty palatable to policymakers. And this constrains the sort of breadth of debate that you could otherwise be having if you were really focused entirely on learning new things about the world. More pressure to be influential. And this was just, something close to either research fraud or massive research incompetence. One participant says, in order to get a sensational result on a certain survey, the questions were designed improperly. This person I knew refused to partner on this project because when she saw the survey questions, she said, I'm not part of that. Those are not solid survey questions. So this other person, he went forward with the survey, did a report, and got praises from his own president of his organization. Think tanks need media attention in order to get funding, in order to stay relevant, for their name to be out there. So how do you get that media attention? Do you get it by doing solid research? Sometimes you need to be a little bit more sensational. So another example about how basically well-intended funders who are trying to bring about whatever this goal is can put pressure on good research practices. Okay, this was a really extreme example. There was a report in this little right-of-center media outlet called the Free Beacon about emails that they obtained through FOIA that reveals that a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress sought and received guidance from a Department of Energy official regarding a Center for American Progress editorial urging Congress to expand funding for the program and permanently establish a Clean Energy Deployment Administration, or Green Bank, to further fund clean energy projects. Now, this one was fascinating because it shows how if you basically, the desire for influence can cause you to want to build positive relationships with lawmakers and the bureaucracy. But if you go too far in trying to build those cordial relationships, you wind up with a wag the dog situation where instead of you developing new ideas and telling them to lawmakers and government officials, the lawmakers and government officials are telling you what to write. And this was a good example of that. And I'm going to read it to you because it was a little too much to put on a slide. So the wonk emailed the bureaucrat saying, we want to tell you about a CAP piece we're submitting to editorial tomorrow and releasing midweek. And we want to make sure it reflects your goals and best thinking. The wonk sent along a copy of the piece, which the bureaucrat read and responded to in a lengthy email containing a number of suggested revisions. Nearly all of them were incorporated into the final draft published days later. The bureaucrat advised, point out that the loans program enjoys widespread support. Also note that the buildup of CEDA requires a transition period. The bureaucrat also suggested that the wonk advocate for additional taxpayer funding for a more common green energy technology and not just the most innovative technology. The wonk was very appreciative of the recommendations and indicated that he would let the bureaucrat sign off on the final version. This is very helpful, the wonk wrote. Thanks so much. I'll include all comments in Titan. We'll send it to you one more time before public. Happy to read the final version, the bureaucrat said, and later wrote a request that the Center for American Progress specifically advocate the transfer of his team at the loans program to run the CEDA. Quote, I'd love to see documents like this call for moving the current management of the loan program over to run the CEDA, because they demonstrated that even under duress they could make it work, the bureaucrat wrote. Think that can get worked in? The wonk responded that the report was glowing with praise for the bureaucrat's team, but he was willing to go further. Quote, would you rather I be more blatant, the wonk said. To a certain point, the bureaucrat replied. The bureaucrat then offered an entire paragraph for the wonk's consideration. The second portion of the bureaucrat's suggested paragraph was directly incorporated into the wonk's final draft. So here we are sort of seeing these sort of the sort of ultimate sort of bottom of the slippery slope. If you work too hard to build solid relationships with bureaucrats and lawmakers, you wind up adding nothing to the discussion. And the bureaucrats and lawmakers simply are using the wonk as a mouthpiece. And that's problematic, of course, because being a wonk is supposed to be about learning new things about the world. So, solutions. What are solutions? I had a very entertaining participant who told me that solving this problem basically involves avoiding becoming either a courtesan or a prostitute. And I said, tell me more. And he said, well, one thing you don't want to be is a courtesan. And a courtesan is a think tank that's heavily existentially dependent on a single donor, or a very small group of donors. So if you're getting the majority of your money from a single source, you're going to inevitably find yourself tailoring your research to the interests of whoever that source is. So there's an ongoing kind of repeat play dependency then, and you become, in essence, a sort of a kept wonk. So you want to avoid that. You want to avoid this dependency on a single source. On the other hand, you don't want to become a prostitute. Now, my participant describes a think tank prostitute as a think tank that will do anything for anybody as long as there's money in it. And if you run around just doing whatever research projects anybody wants to do as long as there's money in it, you completely lose sight of your goal. You lose sight of the mission for which your think tank exists. So presumably, you're trying to line up projects that actually, in some sense, advance your goal, your notion of what positive social change is. So he said, what you really need to look at is, to figure out how to simultaneously avoid being either of those things. So to avoid being a courtesan, you need to have a variety of donors, not just one. But to avoid being a prostitute, you need to have only those donors whose goals actually mesh up reasonably well with your own. So I've had several suggestions from think tank participants, and here are just a handful of them. Several have suggested a firewall, and some of them have this to one extent or another. A lot of them thought it should be stronger between fundraising staff and policy staff. Some suggested that it was important to develop your research agenda first and get it funded second, instead of sort of, letting potential funders approach you with the research ideas, because it's easier to hold on to your goal or mission if you come up with your agenda first. They've suggested just avoiding taking money from funders with clear conflicts of interest. And some have suggested giving policy wonks tenure, or at least term contracts. I think all of those are valuable ideas. One theme that came up repeatedly that I hope that my project will be useful in doing is just to promote a more open dialogue. So I had one participant who said, we actually did a whole staff meeting on ethics. Up until that point, I don't think anyone's ever had a whole staff meeting on ethics. I mean, we talk about, should you do this, should you do this? But when you encounter certain situations around town, it's sort of hit or miss in terms of what think tanks should really be covering, what we should be doing. Someone else said, I have to say people are not really open about that, meaning ethical issues. They don't like to talk about it. It's hard to be almost like a whistleblower in a way on an issue when you know that it could have negative repercussions, either by losing funding or by pissing off the boss. I have good friends that I've known before we were in think tanks, and we can trust and tell each other the bad things, and they won't get out, the names. But I wonder, if we talk about it, these things, I wonder about the other think tanks. It must happen, but you don't hear it. Finally, I think a lot of this comes down to encouraging discussion and dialogue on difficult issues. A think tank, we are very good at our think tank, we're very good at discussing the financial stuff, but I haven't really had conversations with colleagues about the personal ethical stuff, about what you say and what you don't say in public, i.e. intellectual honesty. I think that think tank managers can and probably should encourage more discussion of these issues. So before we go to a discussion, I'm going to pass the baton to Brooke, and she's going to tell you some of her research. I thank you so much for your time and attention, and look forward to your questions.
There are questions. You can take a moment as we read.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. I'll take some questions while the. You may or may not hear the answers, but I can certainly take some questions. Okay, great. Okay. Who has questions? Anyone? Oh, come on, it was fascinating. What do you think? Does anybody have any suggestions about what think tanks might want to do to sort of tackle these problems? Yes?
Yeah, I had a question. You mentioned in a quote there that donors are people that know what looks good, but not what actually works.
Yeah. I think there's a real question whether or not think tanks work. In fact, there's somebody wrote a book, and I can't remember his name now, called "Do Think Tanks Matter?" Because it's very, very difficult to sort of tease out the causal processes for social change. So we'll have some social change. Like right now, we're seeing a massive, very quick shift of opinion on gay marriage, right? What are the causes of that? What happened? Is it because human rights groups were sort of advocating? Did they make a difference? Would it have been the same without them? Almost impossible to tell. And of course, success has a thousand mothers. So when there is some sort of major shift like that, you'll find everybody struggling to take credit for it, and everybody will take credit for it in their reports. But actually figuring out who makes the difference is nearly impossible. I saw one over here. Yes?
So you talked about maybe establishing a firewall between the fundraising arm and the cost arm.
Yeah.
Does it maybe then hurt the think tank itself though to take on that responsibility to basically tell funders what you're funding us for might not be incorporated into our research? I mean, for funders, that's
Yeah.
their goal is to maybe advance the agenda.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, some funders you don't need to promise anything to. So there's a spectrum, and other funders will care about a certain subject area. Like I used to do education policy, and lots of people just care about education policy, so it was always really easy to raise money for that area. And as a result, I think my think tank did somewhat more education policy than otherwise would have, in the balance of things, just because it was so easy to raise money for that kind of work. And so you've got that, and then you've got the next level, and so that can have an effect on your agenda setting function. You wind up doing more of the stuff that's popular with your donors and perhaps less of, say, civil liberties or something that we had a harder time raising money for. And then you move a little further down the line and you start getting funding for specific projects. And once donors are particularly interested in a specific project, then you worry a little bit more about whether the exact message you come up with, is going to be congenial or not to that funder. So I think the difficulty is, the development staffs are, they're sort of recognized and rewarded for their contributions at a think tank to the extent that they raise more money. So there's always an incentive for them to promise more. There's always an incentive to overpromise. And so having this discipline not to overpromise to funders, I think, is one of the big challenges in the think tank world. And there was one back there, yes?
Are there for example, is there anything like the NSF and National NIH in the private funding realm where it's kind of a neutral thing that gives out grants on a effective study?
I guess I don't understand the question. I mean, there definitely is NIH, and there are people that seek NIH grants.
Yeah, but then for example, for think tanks, because mainly those are for academic research.
Oh, I see. You mean like governmental grants for research? Yeah, there are a lot. And in fact, some think tanks even subsist primarily on U.S. government grants. So the RAND Corporation and the Urban Institute, I think both get the majority of their money from one piece or another of the federal government. And that can be good. These people have very reliable source of funds, and they can also, to some extent, pick and choose which contracts they want to bid on. But the danger is if you're mostly relying on that kind of funding, you wind up having the courtesan problem, where you need to produce answers that are congenial to the governmental entities that are funding you. So it's a double-edged sword. Was there one over here? Yes?
Your think tanks are all funded by outside sources. I'm working on a position, I'm in the medical think tank,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a large membership. We're self-funded.
Mm-hmm.
We do get some of the outside grants,
Okay.
like in Dear Abby. There are no restrictions on that.
Right.
Because they just believe in the whole process of what we're doing.
Right.
But I suppose those kind of private think tanks are rare.
You raised a really interesting question, and it sounds like the membership model is working well for you. And some people have thought that they would get more freedom by moving to a membership model, but that won't necessarily produce more freedom. It depends. And one example I would give is the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation decided 8 or 10 years ago that it was going to move to a membership model, in part because it thought it would enhance its independence. So instead of being, dependent on relatively large foundations to contribute and relatively rich individuals, they went to a solicitation model where they now get annual membership dues from millions of people across the country. Sort of millions of working and middle-class conservatives now send the Heritage Foundation $20 or $30 a year. Now, now they no longer have to answer to big donors, but sometimes small donors, can have very strong opinions. And so I think the Heritage Foundation and its scholars have found themselves rather constrained. I think they're producing shorter and simpler research. I think that in general, the tone of their work has become more populist because, they have millions of donors, but those donors have correlated interests, and if you upset a whole big bunch of them, you have a problem. So I think a membership model can certainly sometimes work, but it's not always the answer. I'm sorry, I should move on to Brooke, but thank you all so much.
This is good. This is how we conceived of theory and practice working together. So Marie has given us this survey of the space, some of the big issues, funding issues from the insiders and from the 10,000-foot perspective. Next, we have Brooke Williams, who's an investigative journalist by trade. It particularly is a focus on data-driven journalism, which is part of the work she's done with the Ethics Center. Widely published, a number of very important book chapters and articles all over the major media outlets. I'll note that she's appeared in ABC, World News, the Center for Public Integrity, and New Republic, three of my favorites. And here, the last 2 years at the Ethics Center, she's thought a lot about the economies of influence at work within both think tanks and actual journalistic outlets. And here to share some of her research today of the kind of conflicts of interest that may arise in journalism.
All right.
There you go.
Okay. All right, so I have prepared to talk about think tanks as well, but as a journalist, I have personal experience with institutional corruption in journalism, so I'll breeze through the think tanks and get to the real interesting stuff, I'm sure. So, I mean, you've heard the saying, they say money is power, and I used to think so. I mean, they say knowledge is power. I used to think so, but they meant money. This is actually the rest of the quote. So the power to do what? Knowledge. For our purposes today, I want to look at the power to shape public opinion and public policy. And this is the stuff that has a real impact on our day-to-day lives. These public policies affect us every day. So members of Congress and policymakers at all levels have long relied on the knowledge of others to make important decisions. And this makes a lot of sense. Bringing those with expertise to the table, the scholars who've long been studying the issue at hand, it would seem irresponsible not to. But what if these scholars and experts aren't at the table because they possess the knowledge, but rather because someone has paid them to represent their own interests? All right, so just backing up a bit, just considering our constitutional right to petition the government. It dates back a long time ago. But one of the first significant instances of citizens exercising and defending this right was in the mid-1830s with 130,000 some petitions advocating the end of slavery. So case in point, I mean, think about whatever issue you care about deeply, and I'm sure that you can imagine how it could benefit from effectively, and that's the key, effectively petitioning the government. So those days of citizens petitioning the government are all but over. And enter the professional lobbyists. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. This graph shows, I mean, in 2013, so $3.2 billion. And these are interests hiring lobbyists to advocate on their behalf. So it's very lucrative, and perhaps effective. So these lobbyists, they're friends with lawmakers and staff. They often used to work with them. And most importantly, I think, in terms of institutional corruption, they also represent their lobbying on behalf of companies that the members of Congress depend on for campaign contributions. So there's an incentive to listen to these lobbyists. So what does this mean? And then I'll get to think tanks. Basically, just that only the wealthiest, a tiny fraction of the people who have the right to petition the government, can effectively petition the government. And that is why it's so important for the public to have access to some very basic details. And they are who is paying, how much, and to advocate for what. Lawmakers have attempted to ensure that there are disclosures so that those, who, how much, and for what are disclosed and the public has access to them. For a long time, I mean, there's a separate act for foreign governments and foreign companies, and it actually not only includes advocating on particular legislation, but also trying to influence public opinion, so the media. But what these disclosure rules have missed is an equally exclusive, and what I have found in almost 2 years of collecting data, equally lucrative, billions of dollars a year, non-lobbying industry. So one that also petitions the government, but is exclusive to the wealthiest, who can afford it. And that's where we have some think tanks. And as Marie mentioned, the spectrum of think tanks is huge. I mean, I know of one think tank that shares an office with a 501c3 spending arm that's been spending tens of millions of dollars on campaign ads, so like attack ads you see on TV, and it also shares the same exact office with a super PAC. They call themselves a think tank. And then you have, the Brookings Institution, other think tanks that you might have heard of. So they vary in their mission and their goals. The appearance of intellectual independence, and I think the word think tank in some circles sort of means intellectual independence. It perhaps makes them even more powerful than lobbying firms, because the lobbying firms, remember, have to fill out those quarterly reports telling who, how much, and what for. But at the same time, think tanks, they're seeking donations from companies and foreign governments and foreign companies, specifically and explicitly in exchange for access, influence, and image making. Some think tanks have charts. This one I included, they took it offline once I published a story about it. This is my version that I saved. It's just, you can kind of look at it and say, okay, well, how much access do I want? What's it worth? How much influence? How many meetings do I want? How many policy papers? I could pull one of these up for, I'd guess, half, if not 3/4 of the think tanks, about 6,000 think tanks I've examined. So they're also collecting fees in exchange for giving company lobbyists, so Chevron's lobbyists is one example, as well as foreign officials, seats on advisory boards, so actually charging a fee to belong to an advisory board. And at one think tank recently, 4 out of 6 scholars, for instance, in the clean energy program were simultaneously lobbying for clean energy companies. And that was the last time I checked. I checked again this morning, and a few of them have since left. That's a story that's upcoming. In some cases, foreign governments are actually paying think tanks per paper. I've been filing requests with foreign governments for details on their grants, their contracts, their sometimes non-disclosure agreements with think tanks, and they are, in some cases, paying per paper, paying the salaries of specific scholars, and with very specific details as to what is to be accomplished. And it's always in the government or company's interest. Indeed, what I've found in interviews lately is that companies and foreign governments are going to lobbying firms and they're saying, we're not going to hire you unless you can get us a think tank as a part of this package. Because it's not enough to have advocators. Right now, what companies and foreign governments are insisting on also having scholars. So think tanks as mechanisms for influence is not a new phenomenon. In 1987, Harvard and Brookings held a joint forum to discuss a new Surgeon General report on the effects of secondhand smoke. And some of the internal communications were made public. And I think they speak to how a company sees its relationship with a think tank as beneficial. In addition to what you can see on the screen, this Philip Morris executive went on to say, I mentioned our previous troubles with Brookings regarding support for higher excises and discussed the need to have some countervailing or moderating influences at Brookings if a good relationship is to prevail. I believe he will try his best to satisfy our concerns, but it remains doubtful that the ideological predilection of Brookings will lend itself in these areas to a meeting of the minds with Philip Morris. So, yeah, it's not new. Search for the word think tank in the Foreign Agent Registration Act records, and this is where, again, foreign governments and companies have to disclose when they hire someone to influence US public policy or public opinion. A search for just the word think tank in FARA records produces thousands of results, and I've examined the most recent ones, and almost every single Ministry of Foreign Affairs or embassy that has hired a lobbying firm or public relations firm to help with its image making or to help with whatever goals it has with US public policy has also insisted on communicating and developing strategies with think tanks. This is a portion of one FARA record. This is Saudi Arabia. It went on to say, explain how it was going to help Saudi Arabia turn around its image in the US post 9/11. This is in late 2001. So moving on to journalism. Most of these records, these FARA records, also include these types of lists, like pages and pages and pages and pages of these lists. And their contacts, for the most part, with the media. Which leads me to my personal experience with institutional corruption in journalism. I'm in plenty of these FARA records, I'm sure. I've received countless phone calls and emails from people at embassies, saying, hey, can we get lunch and talk about maybe how, mutual, we could help each other, So it's hard to say how many reporters respond positively to it or go ahead with it, but certainly there is an attempt to use the media to shape public opinion on behalf of foreign governments and private interests. Okay, so as a journalist, I've been an investigative journalist only, and I have what they call the fire in my belly, and that is to hold the powerful accountable. I spend almost every waking hour doing that, and also informing the public. But journalism right now is really in trouble and failing in many ways. So there are three three categories I could think of in my own personal experience as to what has gone wrong with improper influences and dependencies in journalism. So I'll start with money. I've worked at a newspaper for 5 years in San Diego. And at that time, I wrote a story, let's see. Oh, I wrote a story about this, I don't have a picture of it up, but so there was this development, this big developer. Drag it over. Oh, okay. Sorry. Which way? Oh, okay. There was this big developer in San Diego who was one of the biggest advertisers for the San Diego Union Tribune. And anyway, I can keep talking. So they got this government land, and it used to be a Navy base. And they decided they were going to build condominiums on this Navy base. It was all government funded, okay? So taxpayers funded this whole development. And they said, what we're gonna do in exchange for all this money and getting all this land is we're going to put a lottery out for these homes so that everybody has a chance at getting them. And this is in San Diego in, I believe it was 2005, so it was like the height of the real estate boom. And so that went on, and people moved in and whatnot. And I decided to look and see, like, who ended up getting these houses, right? Who ended up getting these condos? And it turned out that a third of the condos went to the companies, executives, their families, their friends. They liked racing cars, their racing buddies. And they insisted that it was a lottery, and I talked to statisticians, and we basically proved it couldn't possibly have been a random lottery. Okay, so this company pulled, I believe it was $2 to $3 million in advertising after I ran that story in the newspaper. This is at the San Diego Union Tribune. And I didn't hear about that for months. I felt really good about the story, you know, like there were no errors. I felt like I'd held the powerful accountable. And I was just in the coffee room one day, and someone said, boy, you know, you cost us like $3 million. What? And I had a great editor who knew that, and she decided that I just didn't need to know, you know. So fast forward 5 years, I've left that newspaper, and was actually at SAFRA. I find out that the newspaper's been purchased by somebody else. And so that's when we get into, we've talked about advertisers, and in my experience, I've never had someone say, don't publish something because an advertiser doesn't want us to. I've heard plenty of stories about that happening. But owners, on the other hand, I think that that's something that's happening more frequently now. So the same newspaper, the new owner of it, Doug Manchester, had developed all of San Diego's waterfront. And so he was someone that I looked into a lot. I mean, as a reporter, thinking if I had still been at the newspaper and he buys it, I'm like, oh my goodness, you know, because I had spent many, many months investigating this developer. He literally owned the coastline in San Diego. And so then he became the publisher of the newspaper, and he hired a CEO, John Lynch. And I decided, they published a front page editorial, okay? So to some people, when they read that front page, they probably thought it was a news story. But it was an editorial, and it was advocating to build a football stadium on the waterfront. And there was a little section that said, the owner, the publisher of this newspaper used to have a bunch of interest in the waterfront, but he sold it all. He has no financial interest anymore. So don't worry about that. Just listen to our, you know, explanation of why you should pay to build a taxpayer-funded stadium on the waterfront. Well, it turns out I searched through SEC records and found out that he had sold the properties, but he sold them in exchange for preferred stock, hundreds of millions of dollars of preferred stock in the companies that own the land. And then I requested a bunch of communications, so emails, right? And it turned out that in addition to misleading the public and pushing for their private interests in the San Diego's only daily newspaper, they were sending emails to public officials threatening them as newspaper CEO. And this is a quote from one of the emails. The port is the Port of San Diego, which handles the waterfront land. And he's basically saying, if you don't do what we want, we're going to be forced to lead a campaign to disband the port. So I think that newspaper owners, in addition to advertisers, I think that they pose a threat to improper use of newspapers and influence, and I'm not sure how reporters are dealing with that, other than every single person, I counted them this morning, 5 reporters who sat around me at that newspaper, every single one of them has left, and can you guess where they went? Any guesses with the next revolving door? So they each went to work as communications officers for the agencies that they covered at the newspaper. So with all the financial constraints and pressure from advertisers, owners, pulling stunts like what I showed you, a lot of reporters at mainstream media outlets are leaving, and they can find good money and work in PR, and they often go to the same places where they develop sources as reporters. So, for instance, the person who covered the DOJ is now the PR person for the DOJ, the port even, you name it. And so then it leads you to question, when did they start negotiating with their future employer, and when did they stop being a journalist whose duty is to inform the public and hold the powerful accountable? And as journalists, I think that we all have a duty to find out. Another issue in journalism right now that's leading to this institutional corruption is the feeling that there's competition. And I'm sure that you sense this a lot with breaking news. There's a sense that, getting it first is important right now. And building sources, for instance, lately in the news, I've seen a lot of quoting of anonymous sources in the FBI and the CIA. And as a reader, sometimes I think it's easy to say, well, that makes sense. They wouldn't want to be named. But we have these legacy media outlets quoting anonymous sources in stories that are literally writing history. And they're doing it in my opinion, because of competition. They're worried that if they wait to get the actual document that says the actual thing that the anonymous source in the CIA or the FBI is saying, that they'll be scooped. So journalism is in trouble, and those are the reasons that I've experienced personally. This is just a little bit of humor, and then I'll take questions. I mentioned that I think it's our duty to figure out when journalists leave media outlets to go work for the government, where their duties, ended, where they stopped being a journalist and where they started being a government official. And so at one point there's a former columnist at the Union Tribune who went to work as the mayor's director of special projects. And I was just really curious what that was, and when he started working for the mayor versus working for the Union Tribune. He was even the writing coach there. His last column, the last sentence was, "I'm sure I'll see the mayor in a golf game soon." So I just was interested and filed a request for communication on a bunch of things. And this is an email in which he's giving advice as to how to respond to a reporter's question. There's an environmental reporter who wanted to know how many decibels a speaker was going to be placed at a beach to scare seals away, okay? And the reporter just wanted to know how loud is it going to be, because all the residents around there wanted to know, and animal rights activists wanted to know, how loud is this going to be? Well, it's going to be 190 decibels, which is like really loud. So here we have the former newspaper columnist, writing coach, editor, telling the mayor's office what to tell the reporter in response to his basic question of how loud is this going to be. That is pretty much it. And so I'm happy to take questions on Think Tanks or journalism.
Fantastic. Take questions, and I'm going to put up one last thing, if you want to take it one step that
Okay.
way. And by the way, so they were assigned, and they saw some of the work you've done on this question of lobbyists working for think tanks, as well as some of the foreign influence of think tanks. So feel free, that's open for discussion as well if they have questions about that.
Awesome. Question? Yes?
How much control would you say you're talking about the owners having a certain amount of influence over their respective outlet, whatever it may be? How direct do you feel that is from the owner to the individual journalist level? Or how is that sort of communicated throughout an organization?
I think it varies organization to organization, and I couldn't possibly know, where I haven't been. From what I've heard, owners can decide. They can either keep a wall up. The previous owners where I used to work, they were the Coffleys and well renowned for sort of promoting their own agendas on the opinion pages of the paper. And we all knew that as reporters, and it didn't really matter much. It never was in the newsroom. The newsroom was on the 3rd floor, editorial was on the 5th floor, it didn't much matter. But from what I understand, the new owners are on the 3rd floor, and they're interacting with editors and reporters. And so that's changed, and I think it depends probably on what the owners, why they bought the newspaper. I mean, this particular individual, Doug Manchester, he's a developer, and a look at what he's been doing with the media outlets he's been buying. It's pretty clear he's using them to advance his agenda as a developer. I think it's safe to say, based on just my experience in the journalism community, that there's more concern now than there was 5 years ago about the lack of a wall between the owners and the advertising team and the reporters. I couldn't even count the number of reporters I know who've just got up and walked out in frustration over being asked to change the language in stories to not upset the owners. And I haven't heard about it in terms of advertisers, which is often what we hear, like what my longtime mentor, who left 60 Minutes, it was because it wasn't just advertisers, it's more like the people who own the media outlet have friends and they have relationships and they don't want to burn those. So it's this fear, I think, of upsetting friends in high places. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you find that the shift in revenue sources away from print advertising and print online can affect this? Is this making a change in these decisions? Or is it amplifying things that
The
with
shift
immediacy
from
of online, change from revenue of print advertising to more online, and
I mean, so I think I'm going to just start by just saying I think that the only model, I personally think the only model for investigative journalism is a nonprofit one, which is why I largely stuck with those. I've noticed online sponsored content seems to be more popular than, you know, a newspaper can, when I was there at least, it could charge like $30,000 for a page, an ad. I mean, a lot of money, right? I think they charge quite a bit less for online ads. But sponsored content that appears to be journalism, I think that they can make more money that way. So I think it's very concerning. The lines between advertising and journalism seem to be getting more blurred online with sponsored content. I mean, even you've seen Sully's talk, even Jim Romanesco, the watchdog of journalists, is using sponsored content now. So.
In sponsored content, to be clear, it's you, and this, at least the way Andrew Sullivan described it to us 2 weeks ago, it's somebody who actually pays to have a piece written that might be confused with regular journalism.
Right.
So that when you look at the page and you think, here's an article that's been written by somebody, not realizing that it was, say, placed by a company or somebody with a specific interest, it's basically an advertisement that looks like journalism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they even have like a byline. I mean, sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference between them. So, but nonprofit organizations, they're all over the country now, and they have issues like think tanks do. You know, I should be very, very careful with who they accept money from, what their agendas are, building a wall between the funders and the journalists. But at least they're not trying to make money, right?
So if we were to collect between the first sense we go into journalism, we say there are various conflicts of interest that might arise. You have the owners, who are maybe the first round of funders, but those are at least fairly narrow, usually a few wealthy individuals. You might have the owner's friends, then you have advertisers, which are this much more substantive source of wealth. These are both funders of sorts. They have their own interests, and the worry is that they're exerting influence in the kind of knowledge that's get out, the knowledge that's reported. And this can be both fluff pieces that support their position, or it could be canceling various sorts of investigative pieces that might embarrass their positions or be bad for them in various sorts of ways. And Marie, if I heard you in the same way, you're worried about various ways in which think tanks are compromised in their research orientation, that is, discovering the truth about the world because of these other competing, generally financial interests, professional interests, et cetera.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, and sort of, I think sometimes, research is the particular way in which think tanks have undertaken to achieve a social change goal. And that's problematic because there are multiple ways to achieve a social change goal. But think tanks play a critical role. So you can have all the pundits and all the politicians in the world, but without any new ideas that you get from real research process, those people are going to run out of things to do that are productive, that bring about productive change in the world. So that's why we need think tanks. But because research is expensive and because it doesn't always pan out the way you think it's going to, there's this constant pressure to take these shortcuts, to become pundits, to become activists, become political characters instead of scholars. So I think that's the incentive problem. And and individuals and foundations that support think tanks, often care more about the goal than they do about the research process. And I think partially that's just an education problem. People who aren't researchers themselves just don't necessarily grok the kind of undertaking that research is. So in my experience with think tank donors, we've got a lot of people who tend to think that conclusions follow relatively unproblematically from a set of normative priors. So they're like, I'm giving to the progressive think tank, or I'm giving to the libertarian think tank. So we've got, a broad-based or broad-brush sense about what we want to bring about in the world normatively, right? And so often those donors sort of don't grasp that those premises don't extrapolate directly to conclusions about whether Head Start works, or conclusions about whether charter schools work. So there are all kinds of really thorny empirical questions that, your first principles just don't give you tools to answer. And so where think tanks add value is they say, look, maybe these are your normative premises and that's fine. you know, but this program might still not work the way you think it does, because that's a very complicated question about how the world works. And so I think that's a problem that constantly think tankers need to mediate with donors, because insofar as donors are not themselves scholars, they honestly just don't always grasp the complexity of the relationship between principles and actual research findings.
Okay. I wanted to take a few minutes at the end here. We've hit it at solutions, and I think this is a big question for us sort of on the table now. These are conflicts of interest, the types of which we've seen throughout this course, and the question is, are we at sort of a crisis point, a tipping point, or there's a few standard arguments about why this might be okay. One is an argument classically advanced by John Stuart Mill, right, that in the play of public debate, there'll be a marketplace of ideas. The progressive funders do this, the conservative funders do this, but at the end of the day, it'll wash out and we'll get the truth. One of the questions is, can you have a permanent skewing of the kind of the knowledge that's produced so that actually something is never going to rise to the top because it never gets into the arena to begin with, because nobody has the funding to actually do the investigation. What is going to be permanently locked out of the system versus what is going to be contested and maybe will win out over time? We've had another solution suggested by Brooke, which is you might think of various nonprofit foundations. So I guess Center for Public Integrity is one of these that actually has a sort of large endowment, right, and donor base that allows it to, and fund, I'd say, what, foundation donor base, is that where they're?
Yeah, the foundations. ProPublica, I think, has the endowment. But.
Oh, yeah. So this might be one way of insulating it from some of these standard conflicts of interest. This was, a year ago, we had to think a lot about the solutions and about the way the knowledge is produced. And one thing that I noted was when you look at the political spectrum today, you have a lot of these very mission-driven think tanks that are ideological. So this is Frank Gaffney's think tank, the Center for Security Policy. Frank's a neoconservative, cares a lot about national security. And what's interesting in politics is you constantly have people's interests. They're trying to figure out who their allies are and who their enemies are. Now, Frank shared office space with Grover Norquist, who headed the Americans for Tax Reform. They shared it was a printer room. The offices adjoining each other. They had a weekly meeting for people on the right. And you might say in the first instance, why do national security hawks care about tax policy? I mean, if anything, the tax people are trying to reduce the amount of money available, and the military people want more military spending. They're kind of strange bedfellows to bring together. Nonetheless, they made common cause. They did a lot of things together, and they were kind of common advocates for a number of things that match with their ideological agendas. And one question that we might ask is, to what degree monetary interests might break up coalitions, coalitions of advocacy? I'll also note you've seen the commercials, right? T. Boone Pickens, somebody who's given over $5 million in political donations, generally to the right, a big supporter of George Bush's. He started the Swift boats or Swift vets against Kerry. So somebody who seems like a man of the right. And yet in his most recent venture, he gave something like $500,000 to this progressive think tank to support its clean energy projects. And there's this question as to where do his main interests lie? Is he actually maybe less of a conservative advocate and somebody willing to give money if it will support his own sort of oil interests? And it's worth thinking about sort of the big picture of where do you think the line should be drawn. So within think tanks, we've talked about the research role, which is something about truth, but they also very legitimately and forthrightly say we care about advocacy, right? We care about making an impact, about persuasion. They form this other function that Larry's talked about. They're sort of a farm league for people who are out of office and want to go back in. So every time administration comes over, the people who were in the last one kind of go in and out of think tanks. But for both of these things, the problem I think we're talking about is this problem of shilling. The shill is someone who's a plant or a stooge. It's someone who helps a person or organization without disclosing their relationship. They purposely give onlookers the impression they're enthusiastic, independent customers of a seller or market ideas, but you're secretly working there. And it's the idea that you can be bought off. You can say, I'm an objective, independent researcher, but at the end of the day, I'm working as a shill. So what's the problem of shilling more strategically? The problem is that I think research and advocacy are in tension, right? If you want the truth versus if you want an outcome, they may not always be aligned. Each has a place, but we've discussed particularly, with both Marie and Brooke's work, how these can upset each other. If you think of a little model of shilling, it turns out if you do too much of one or the other, you can get in trouble. So you might raise a lot of funds. You start raising your funds, But at a certain point, you might get away from the actual ideological convictions that legitimated some advocacy group to begin with, and this can cause partnerships to kind of go apart. So you might be optimistic that the strategic implications of this sort of balancing act will keep people somewhat honest. So if you shill for too many bad ideas, you can lose credibility. If they're false, if people know that you put out crap reports, if it turns out the people who originally supported you ideologically realize that you've gone astray. So this is one way in which you might have some internal disciplines in this scenario, but what are some of the solutions? So one thing, when you ask about the NSF funding, one idea is we might just fund social science research outside of any advocacy role. So people at Harvard government department applies for grants. They want to know what's the outcome of welfare policy on these certain variables of family cohesion. Let's just have objective social science outside of frames of advocacy. I think there's a question of whether that can be done, whether there is value neutrality within academia, and also there's speech concerns. Certainly we don't want to restrict research to these circumstances or these contexts, but that's one model. So you might have this sort of separation of different interests. You might restrict advocacy more directly. You might try to have the way in which we restrict various campaign speech apply to think tanks too. And one of the reasons that it's a big issue whether you're a lobbyist or a think tank is lobbyists have to register, they pay income taxes. Think tanks, depending on their designation, can have a lot of tax benefits. They're considered educational organizations often, charitable organizations. So this matters a lot, and perhaps you want to have think tanks under a different sort of legal governance model. But let me talk about some of the ironies that have played out over the two examples I started with. It turns out Pickens' influence at the Center for American Progress was somehow short-lived. So once his money ran out, once his donation ran out, they did an about face and published pieces declaring things like natural gas is a bridge to nowhere. And as this one commentary notes, apparently on the left, money can buy you love, but only for so long. Boone was basically, T. Boone was burned by CAP, and he accused him of flip-flopping, and this was a problem worked out between sort of donors and their advocates. And you might think at the end of the day, the Center for American Progress returned to its mission, and Pickens was just burned because he tried to go too far outside of his ideological space to buy and purchase scholarship that would only last as long as the money did. Frank Gaffney ran into a debate with Grover Norquist when it turns out that Grover was trying to bring conservative Muslims into the center-right fold and had begun to cultivate a lot of relationships. One thing he founded was this Islamic Institute, which is supposed to promote free market ideas amongst the American Muslims. But it turns out he unfortunately, in the process of doing this, started accepting checks from a guy named A. Al-Umidi. That's Abdurraham Al-Umudi. That's on the bottom of that check, who it turns out had a lot of ties to some fairly unsavory radical Islam groups, which happened to be the antithesis of what Frank Gaffney cared about in national security space. So he and Frank parted ways in some very acrimonious debates. They no longer share office space. So you might think of these as ways of sort of the marketplace of ideas and interests working themselves out, people getting burned when in fact their money runs out. One thing that people talk about throughout this course is sunlight and what effect that can have of disclosure. If Center American Progress had to disclose the funding from T. Boone Pickens, would they have done it in the first place? And secondly, this idea of enlarging conflict. There's a lot of think tanks in Washington, D.C. You can take out of Madison, his proposal for a large republic, you might think of a large think tank space where a lot of different think tanks can call each other to town, where journalists like Brooke can be supported by Center for Public Integrity and write pieces on how CAP is accepting donations from certain groups that don't align with their interests. So this is just to think about the policy space out there and how you might want to understand the complexities of how advocacy have worked and what the trade-offs are within the current space. And when you think of your own solutions to this as to where we are, I think you should consider both what do you think legitimate advocacy is and what it would mean to have a compromised search for truth. That is, when do financial conflicts mean that people should no longer be understood as sort of objective researchers, but simply as shills. So I just wanted to lay that sort of groundwork out. On Thursday, we're going to think more precisely about universities, because research-based, at least here, is married with advocacy, But in universities, it's supposed to be about the truth. And that's a question of whether we're all here in that enterprise pursuing that in the way we should be. So see you on Thursday.